Okay, good afternoon. I'm Valerie Cofield, President and CEO of the Eastern Minority Supplier Development Council, and I am pleased to welcome everyone to today's presentation on Manufacturing 101. We do know that there are others expected to join us, but in the interest of your time and to ensure that we're able to cover everything, we want to get started. I am so excited that we're able to present today's workshop. We're doing it in partnership with the Business Center and DVRC. Our speaker today is Andrew Dahlgren, who we've been working with very closely, EMSDC and the Business Center, on the launch of our IMAX Center, which you will find out a little bit in the course of this presentation today. And so with that, I want to say welcome. I want to turn it over to Pam Rich-Wheeler, Executive Director of the Business Center, who's going to share a few words before we get started. Thank you. Pam, on to you.
Thank you, Valerie. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be a part of this workshop, Manufacturing 101, in partnership with EMSDC and DVIRC. It is our hope in this joint partnership that we're able to bring you programming that keeps at the forefront opportunities for entrepreneurship and staying in areas of industries where you can have a place at the table for a person of color or a woman. And I'm going to, at this time, hand it over to Andrew and enjoy the workshop.
Hi, everybody. And thanks for sharing some of your time with me to learn about and hear about manufacturing. We're gonna, kind of the outline of today is I'm gonna share with you some information to help to hopefully demystify a little bit about manufacturing. And then at the end, we'll open it up to some questions and answers. And we hope to provide some specific details, then we could potentially answer some specific questions if you are an entrepreneur and have a business that you're working on. But we also might have to keep it sort of limited and open to general questions. But the good news is that there's other programming that we're working on to continue the conversation. So if you don't find your answer today, hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to provide other resources, other workshops, other conversations that can help you kind of wherever you are on your business development journey. So I'm going to share with everybody my screen. All right. So just a kind of brief introduction about why we're doing this now and why DVRC, which stands for Delaware Valley Industrial Resource Center, is interested in partaking in this conversation. So DVRC has been involved in a project called the Manufacturing Access Project for the past 4 years. And the goal of the project has been to find ways to connect elements of the regional industrial ecosystem. You know, there's lots of different parts to the ecosystem, including business owners, entrepreneurs, universities, workforce development organizations, et cetera. There's a lot of different parts and pieces to the local ecosystem. But ultimately, what we found before the project was started is that a lot of these different elements don't really interact very much. If you're an entrepreneur, it can be hard to build relationships with manufacturers. If you're a local university, you might find it difficult to have industry partners. And even sometimes if you're a workforce development organization, you might struggle to find places for job placement. So the project was really looking at how do we connect different elements in different ways. And more specifically, the part of the project that I am working on is related to how entrepreneurs connect to manufacturers. And in our early findings, in our early couple of years of work, we realized that there were some misunderstandings of capabilities. What that means is that we know that entrepreneurs aren't aware of manufacturing capabilities in the region, and vice versa, that manufacturers aren't aware of the demand of production in the region. You know, we find, just like we hear in a lot of other places, that information is siloed, which makes it difficult for product developers to learn about cost-saving strategies from and with SMMs. And so ultimately, this Manufacturing 101 event and these kind of initiatives connecting with small business development centers, for example, is all about trying to make these new connections. And so this is just a quick outline of what we're going to talk about today. Manufacturing is a huge topic, and it's something that obviously we can't talk about and cover completely in just an hour, hour and a half. So ultimately, what I'm presenting here is kind of an introduction to a lot of different things, which hopefully will, again, maybe answer some of your immediate questions. And if anything, it just kind of gives you a little bit of a seed of an idea to maybe do more research or reach out to me. So I'll be sharing my contact information and possible next steps at the end of the presentation. Between each section, I will pause. And so if you have a question about something I said, feel free to make a note in the chat or in the Q&A function. At the end of the presentation, we'll be using the kind of hands raising idea where you can raise your hand and then we'll unmute you and you can ask the question. If the question seems really specific or something that makes more sense to hold off until the end, I'll just kind of announce that and we'll do our best to try to get to everybody's questions. So first, I want to dig into just understanding design and manufacturing jargon. We find a lot of entrepreneurs come to building a business from a lot of different backgrounds. It might be a certain expertise you had in your career and your job, and you're transitioning that into a business idea. Other people, maybe come from a background in, say, product design, fashion design, et cetera, and they have a little bit of knowledge about manufacturing. But we find for the most part, manufacturing tends to be one of the bigger barriers, especially early on in business development. And a lot of that comes from just not knowing what different phrases mean and what information is kind of needed to engage with manufacturers. And so first, just kind of a high level understanding of what is manufacturing as a definition. I've included here just, again, the standard dictionary definitions of what it means to manufacture. And you notice very quickly that they're very vague. And you also see that we might have an association with manufacturing being about mass production, but that's actually not the case. Like the definition of manufacturing isn't specific to, say, mass production or producing lots of units at the same time. And so what I like to do is I like to define manufacturing as the use of technology and labor to transform raw and or recycled materials into finished goods. And if we can start there and acknowledge that technology and labor make up the kind of two things needed to do manufacturing, then we can get a better understanding of different strategies to use in order to manufacture in different ways. So to dig into technology a little bit more, we can think of it and we can organize technologies into two ways. One is specialized technology, as in dedicated equipment used to make a specific part or a finished product. And so a good example of that is a mold for making shoe soles. So this picture in the top right, that's a piece of equipment, it's a piece of technology that is invested in order to manufacture one sole for the manufacturing of shoes. And so no matter what, for the lifespan of this tool, it can only do one thing. It can only make shoe soles, and it can only make it at this specific size. And so this is, again, an example of a specialized technology in manufacturing. Flexible technology is equipment that can be used to make a variety of parts and or finished products. And so examples of that are, say, a table saw or a 3D printer. And so this bottom right picture is an example of a 3D printer. And what the flexible technology means is that, you could make one toy and then the next thing on the printer could be a hook for hanging something. The next object could be, a cup for holding liquid. So the lifespan of this piece of equipment is flexible. It can do lots of different things while it's in use. We also hear the phrase legacy or traditional technology. And so what that means is that's production technology that's been used for many generations that is still in use today. So any type of manufacturing process that's been around for hundreds of years, that's an example of traditional technology. Even technologies that are, say, 30 years old, those are still considered traditional technology. So die cutting, injection molding, cutting and sewing of apparel, metal stamping, table saws, chop saws, et cetera. Like all those are different examples of traditional technology. And so why that's important to know about is some manufacturers only have what's called traditional technology. And so in order to work with them, you have to make sure that the production processes that you're potentially needing are this kind of older manufacturing process. Another phrase that we hear a lot is advanced manufacturing technology, or AMT for short. And basically that's defined as innovative and cutting edge contemporary production technology. And so we hear the phrase Industry 4.0, subtractive and additive manufacturing, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But ultimately, AMT is technology that's relatively new to the manufacturing world. And we don't see a lot of manufacturers necessarily investing in a lot of AMT, especially if they have a lot of traditional technology. And so some innovators and some entrepreneurs today are maybe making products that can only be made using AMT. And so again, knowing what type of technology you might need is going to influence the type of manufacturing relationships you try to build. So just a quick kind of tangent. Some of you might have heard the phrase Industry 4.0, and ultimately today that represents a lot of different things. It can include cloud computing, it can include simulation, autonomous robots, et cetera, like all these different kind of bubbles. Now, additive and subtractive manufacturing are the kind of most important parts of Industry 4.0 as it relates to you as an entrepreneur, as somebody, who is interested in engaging in conversation with a manufacturer. So to explain additive manufacturing just a little bit, additive manufacturing is the use of technologies that build 3D objects by adding layer upon layer of material, whether that's plastic or concrete or metal or ceramics. There's lots of different types of additive manufacturing technologies out there today. The bottom left uses plastic, the bottom right is printing in metal, the top left is printing in ceramics. And again, like you don't necessarily need to become an expert in additive manufacturing, but it is potentially something that you might need in, say, the prototyping part of a product development. Subtractive technology is the process by which 3D objects are constructed by successively cutting material away from a block of material. And in today's world, we have all sorts of different, what we call CNC equipment, and that stands for computer numeric control. And basically that means that the tool itself can be controlled by a computer with the human kind of writing the program to actually tell the machine what to do. And so, on the bottom right, we have a water jet cutter that can cut, in this case, it's cutting marble, but water jet machines can cut steel, different types of metals, foams, different types of stones, etc. We have 5-axis machine mills that can rotate parts in 3 different axes to make very complex pieces. And then the top right, we have more of the most experimental cutting, which is using robotic arms with different types of cutting head tools to cut material. And again, some of you might already be using these technologies. Some of you might not know about these at all. And that's okay. Ultimately, we'll give you resources to learn more about these things. So if manufacturing is technology plus labor, to kind of break down labor just a little bit, we can define labor as unskilled or skilled. And unskilled meaning that kind of the traditional sense is that someone is trained in only one step of a production process, and they typically don't have say over how parts are made, versus skilled labor, which is someone trained in all and multiple steps of a production process. It has the ability to decide best way to make parts. Now, when we put these two things together, say specialized technology or flexible technology or skilled labor, unskilled labor, that's when we start to see different ways in which we can start to define manufacturing that we as entrepreneurs and business owners might need to seek out. Now, these phrases there's no real dictionary definition or legal definition as to what mass produced means, or small batch, or mass customized, et cetera. And so what that means is we kind of use these phrases as a general rule of thumb when we're engaging in conversation with manufacturers or potential other parts of the supply chain. So, mass produced to one manufacturer might be 10,000 units, but to another manufacturer, a mass-produced object could be, say, 100,000 units because of the type of technology, labor, and materials, et cetera, that they're working with. So I'm sharing with you these phrases again with a kind of general description rather than a legal or dictionary definition, just because those don't really exist. So we typically talk about mass-produced objects when we're talking about high quantities of identical products. Small batch is a phrase used if we want smaller quantities of identical products. Mass customization means a slight variation of a product. And so an example of that is, say that you allow the customer to pick a color, or you allow a customer to, say, pick an image that's going to be engraved on a surface. Those are examples of slight variations from product to product. And then you have craft or artisanal production, which is what we consider as sort of one-off or very low quantities of identical products. On the other side of the conversation, in order to engage with manufacturing, we have to be aware of certain design language and certain design kind of concepts. And so iteration is just a kind of term that means that we have a rough concept in early, as in the phrase, an early design iteration. And so it's important to know when you're talking to a manufacturer, where you are in your kind of product development. Are you still at an iteration stage and you're looking just for feedback, or are you in the phase of actually getting a prototype made, or are you actually trying to get a run of units produced? Now, even within the prototype kind of realm, there's different types of prototypes, like looks-like prototypes, which might not have any function, but it gives us a general size, shape, and material that we're making something out of. Works-like prototype is actually something that functions the way we want it to, even if it might not be fully kind of aesthetically the right way. In certain industries, like the textile industry, for example, they use, again, specific words to the industry, like sample in the textile industry is used kind of as we would say a prototype in other sectors. And then finally, a proof of concept is typically a prototype that has some but not all details. And that's usually used to, say, do user testing, or to potentially show to potential investors about what the concept is and how it works. Those of you who are familiar with the lean startup might have heard the phrase minimal viable product. And ultimately, a minimal viable product is kind of a type of prototype. It's a version of your product that allows your team to learn from customer feedback and learn about potential market buy-in. Now, for the manufacturing sector, typically this concept of a minimal viable product is something that a lot of manufacturers kind of struggle with, mostly because traditionally manufacturers want you to have the design finished and ready to go, and they don't want you to be changing your design over time. And so if you're still kind of working through a minimal viable product, it might be important, actually, it's definitely important to communicate with your manufacturers, where you are in your process, like how likely is your current kind of MVP going to change over time. The last kind of piece of jargon to know about, again, with the kind of entrepreneurial mindset in mind, is understanding what type of manufacturing you're interested in taking on. For the most part, you're going to look for what's called a contract manufacturer. And basically, that's a company that you can hire to produce your product for you, as compared to establishing your own in-house production capabilities. So if you envision building a business and doing in-house manufacturing, you can totally do it. And there are resources and experts out there that can help you identify the right machinery and the right equipment, et cetera. But I think the majority of entrepreneurs are actually more interested, at least especially at the beginning of a business development, to seek out relationships with contract manufacturers. Now, it's important to know that there's kind of two types of contract manufacturers out there. One, original equipment manufacturer, or OEM for short. And those types of manufacturers are typically need you to bring to them specified and finished designs, versus an ODM, or original design manufacturer, which typically has kind of multiple services under one roof. And so they could work with you to design, engineer, and then also produce the part. Now, there's lots of different questions you can ask yourself as to which one you'd rather work with, an OEM or ODM. We could get to that as well. But ultimately, you can think about this too as what type of skill set do you maybe have in your team, in your business? and which kind of expertise do you want to build through relationship. So I'll pause there and see if there are any questions or comments to respond to yet. So again, feel free to add any notes in the chat or the Q&A, and I can respond to them now, or we can keep anything to the end as well. Okay, I don't see any now, so we can move on to the next section, and then if anything pops up, we can circle back. Okay, so I realize I'm giving you a lot of information very quickly, and that's only ultimately because manufacturing is such a big topic and a big, kind of industry, and it also is, you could both talk about it in generic terms, but also with individual businesses, it gets very specific very quickly. So again, this is being recorded, and so you'll get a copy of the video, but you also get a copy of the slides, and you can circle back to those as well. Okay, so part 2, what is a supply chain? So a supply chain, again, could be defined in lots of different ways. And so just kind of generally speaking, a supply chain includes the flow of all information, products, materials, and funds between different stages of creating and selling a product to the end user. And so a lot of you maybe have seen a supply chain diagram or kind of understand a supply chain in this kind of visual sense, where we can think about all the steps it takes to manufacture a product, from where the raw material is, all the way through how it's manufactured, potentially packaged, warehoused, etc. And so this is, again, it can be a useful tool for people to think about what the supply chain looks like. If you're familiar with the business model canvas, you might be familiar with key relationships and key resources. And in essence, those could be mapped onto your supply chain as well. It's important to point out that the supply chain can vary from kind of company to company, as well as from product to product. And so right now it's very specifically called out where, say, manufacturing is separate from assembly, separate from packaging and warehousing. But depending on your potential partners, packaging and assembly might be under one roof, manufacturing and assembly might be under one roof. Or it might actually be like this, where you're actually dependent on like each box representing a different company in the process. You'll see there's also different ways of navigating it. So there are companies that will do what's called drop shipping. And so you can go from a warehouse to a user, or from a warehouse to, say, a storefront to a user, et cetera. So the supply chain kind of visualization in this sense is really meant to be a way to kind of keep yourself organized. There are different software packages that help you manage a supply chain. But even if you could just kind of sketch out the relationships between each one, you can definitely kind of get a sense of what type of resources you as an entrepreneur need to find to be successful. Now, it's important to identify that your supply chain depends on where you are in your product development process. So basically, this kind of outlines, like different places that some of you may be. Like some of you maybe have already produced an initial batch. Others of you are ready just to do prototyping. Some of you might actually have a supply chain somewhere else in the world and you want to kind of move it to someplace local. So it's always important to kind of ask yourself where you are in your product development, because that's going to affect the supply chain you want to create. And so again, if I see there's a question in the chat, so once I get through this section, I'll pause and respond to that one. So obviously, like each supply chain for every product is going to be slightly different. So without trying to kind of articulate one example and explain it, I find it's easier to kind of give elements that you as entrepreneurs need to kind of think about and answer for yourselves, with the goal being that if you can answer these questions, you can shorten the time it takes to find the right partners. So if you can define these things, these items, which I'll walk through in just a second, if you can define these in a way, it kind of starts to give you a set of criteria, which then guides your kind of search process. So first, knowing what scale in terms of as defined by quantity is important to know. So for example, again, are you looking for one unit to be purchased? You know, are you trying to do custom manufacturing? Are you trying to do or are you trying to find a prototype? Are you looking more for the sort of 1 to 100 range, which again might be defined as custom or small batch? Are you looking for 100 to 1,000, 10,000 plus? And again, these terms aren't perfect definitions. You know, it's not that if you have 9,999, you're still doing small batch. But again, these are general kind of terms. The reason these numbers are important to know is because some manufacturers are really well equipped to say make one of something, while other manufacturers are only equipped to make 10,000 and above of something. So if you can first identify for yourself how many units you need, that goes a long way in helping find the right manufacturer. Size in terms of dimension is also very important. You know, there's manufacturing of with metal that happens at all different scales. For example, you can have a company that specializes in manufacturing jewelry, and then you could have a company that specializes in building prefab architecture, and all of them use metal. But the manufacturer of prefab architecture won't be able to respond if you're working at the jewelry scale. And so again, these terms, there really aren't any hard-held definitions for, say, what's handheld size, tabletop, et cetera. But again, just knowing what size object you're actually trying to make will impact who you can find to manufacture your product. Knowing what type of materials you want to use. Is it an off-the-shelf material, meaning that anybody can kind of purchase it? Or is it a unique or hard to find material, or are you going to want to identify a customized made-to-order material? There are some manufacturers that will only use materials that they supply. So if you have a very unique material, like it's going to impact whether you can work with that manufacturer or not. Sometimes manufacturers will also help you source materials, but in other cases, you might have to do your own kind of sourcing and supplying and shipping to the manufacturer. Yeah. So knowing a bit about different manufacturing processes and technology is helpful, but again, it's not necessary for you to become an expert in any one thing. It is important to know, you know, maybe you're developing a product that really does need someone's hand, or maybe you're building a brand where that's part of the narrative, and the selling point is that this is a kind of made by hand product. And then in other cases, you might need very specifically to use mechanized technology. And in that case, you might need to invest in custom tooling, or maybe you need a program that will operate a CNC piece of technology. And again, maybe you don't know, and maybe you're looking for feedback about maybe it is affordable to do it by hand, or maybe it's more affordable to do it with mechanized technology. But having some sense internally, like what's the value of made by hand or mechanized for your brand. Location. So some companies want to have a product manufactured close to them. Again, it might fit the narrative of your business and your values. For some, it might be more of a logistics thing where you want to work locally because you can sort of respond to challenges a bit faster. But in some cases, there are certain manufacturers and certain manufacturing capabilities that don't necessarily exist within our region. And so in that case, you might be forced to go national or even international. And so again, as a business owner, making those decisions for yourself, like, do you prefer to find a regional manufacturer or not? Because that will affect what tools you can use and how you can go about finding manufacturers. So again, if you can define these different elements for yourself, then it starts to give you a guide to help narrow down your search process. It's important to know that your supply chain is very likely to change. And so, for example, you might start out with needing to say make prototypes, and you might need to use off-the-shelf materials, and you might rely on digital fabrication because you're making 3 and it needed them to be done in a certain time frame. And over time, as your company has success, your scale has changed to say you need 1,000 units in a batch, and now because you've got larger orders, and maybe you have control over the materials, and you actually want to make a more customized material. And you might make the choice to invest in dedicated tooling, and you might invest in bringing your supply chain closer to you. So as entrepreneurs, it's important to know when your supply chain changes, what the kind of tipping points are, what the kind of scaling up moments may be. Now, it is possible that you work with a manufacturer that does work at this initial scale on the left and still works at the initial scale, the second scale on the right. It's just a matter of really having a dialogue with manufacturers to understand what are their limitations, what are they capable of, and when they might be able to say, you need to find another kind of supply chain partner. We get questions from entrepreneurs about going it alone and owning their own production. And it can be done. Companies do successfully take on in-house manufacturing, or they do a hybrid where they depend on part of the supply chain being made by other people, but then they invest in their own in-house production. And ultimately, as an entrepreneur, you just kind of have to ask yourself, like, what part do you want to take on? Because if you do in-house production, it means you're owning and taking on, say, new technology purchases, managing materials, overseeing workforce, et cetera. It changes the potential sort of dynamic of your own business, doing in-house manufacturing versus outsourcing it. All right, so I'll pause there and see questions that are coming up. All right, so somebody shared the question, do flexible technologies wear out faster, i.e. do you have to build in obsolescence if you buy it, or make it reliable contacting a manufacturer? So flexible technologies come in a range of kind of durability. So for example, even with 3D printing, which is considered like one of the most flexible technologies, they make what's called sort of consumer 3D printers, something that could be used in somebody's household, which can be very cheap. And then they make industrial scale 3D printers today. And so the technology, the kind of consumable parts of the machine, or the equipment that goes into the machine is more durable. And so it might be something that, if you started with an at-home printer, that could wear out very quickly, depending on how frequently you're maintaining it, how frequently you're running it, how many hours you're running it, et cetera. But ultimately, the industrial equipment is, say, designed to run 24/7. And so it's going to have a much longer lifespan. And so there's not a kind of rule of thumb where flexible technology wears out faster. It really comes down to whether that piece of equipment is designed for high production runs or not. Second question is where is the quality control, and is it in each step? And so, yes, it's definitely, quality control is definitely in every step of the supply chain. So even at the materials level, like at the first step of just sourcing materials, that company should have its own quality control and sets a certain standard. And then even in the part level, after parts are being manufactured, each part there should be some level of quality control before going on to assembly, and then after assembly, et cetera. So quality control is definitely a big part of managing a supply chain. And that's something you can engage in conversation with your manufacturers. What are their quality control standards? And they typically are going to have a kind of standard quality control setup. And if for some reason you need a higher level, then maybe that's a negotiation where they treat yours differently. Also, there's different types of industry standards that different companies can go through to get certified to meet certain level of quality. And so, for example, if you're an entrepreneur that plans to sell to the Department of Defense or sell to like the medical fields, those require, in order to deliver and meet those standards, they require certain certifications that a manufacturer has to go through. And so you can ask for from manufacturers and suppliers, et cetera, you can ask if they have certain quality control certifications or not. And then you can ultimately use that as a way to narrow down your focus as well. Next question is, during the prototyping phase, when do you need a patent? So patenting and intellectual property protection is a very complicated conversation, and there is no one size fits all for all entrepreneurs. Some entrepreneurs don't do any patenting or any intellectual property protection. And for some, it's very, very important. And it really, it's from my point of view, and I know people disagree with me, it's sort of a philosophical point of view. Like, do you feel that, is it really important to you to protect your information? And granted, it's going to be different from one industry to the next. If you're working in, say, the textile and apparel industry, it's actually very, very difficult to patent any type of apparel design. In other industries where research and development, like pharmaceuticals, is very expensive, then it's much more important to protect, because you want to find ways to protect that cost of that research and development. When it comes to manufacturers, one method that a lot of people adapt is getting companies to sign a non-disclosure agreement, or an NDA. And so that can kind of create a form of comfort with the manufacturer, where you'll find that they, some companies will sign them, some companies don't. And again, that will maybe affect how you decide to approach them or not. So in most cases, what I recommend is, if you do want to implement an NDA, typically it's going to be at the point before you start to share drawings or any sort of visualization of the product to a manufacturer. Now, I will share that for the most part, especially in the United States, most manufacturers aren't really well equipped to steal your design. And what I mean by that is, most manufacturers don't have the ability to take a product idea, move it all the way through product development, move it all the way through marketing, and get it to like a product to the market. They're just not equipped to like sort of do that business development. And actually, as contract manufacturers, they're not in that business at all, right? They're dependent on people coming to them and saying, I want this product manufactured. And so that's also something just to keep in mind, is that if there's a fear of a manufacturer stealing an idea, again, like, think about the investment it would take for them to like do anything with that idea. So I'm not trying to talk anybody into or out of patent protection, but ultimately it is kind of a choice that every entrepreneur has to make for themselves. And again, the NDA is probably the first easiest step to kind of build a sense of comfort when communicating with the manufacturer. The question about manufacturing of feminine hygiene products is something I can speak to more maybe at the end. It's just a specific question that I think we can kind of keep to the end and come back to. Same question. There's another question about food-based manufacturing. And again, so I'll try to touch on the more specific industry questions at the end. Okay. So let me jump back. Okay. So scaling production is the next part of the presentation. And ultimately, what do I mean when I say scaling production? And again, kind of generically, it means it's increasing the number of units being made by utilizing more efficient ways of making more units more rapidly. And I know that sentence uses the same word multiple times, but ultimately, the most important thing to take in mind is that typically we talk about scaling from the lens of like, we're getting more efficient at making something. Going from, say, purchasing 20 units to 40 units to 60 units, in essence, that's not quite scaling in this way. Like, yes, you're placing more orders, but scaling traditionally through the lens of kind of manufacturing and business development, it's really looking at how do we make more efficiently. And so traditionally, this has been done by transitioning from flexible technology to dedicated technology, from skilled handwork to mechanized dedicated technology. And ultimately, the big kind of motivating factor here is if we can find more efficient ways of making something, we can find ways of making the production costs go down, right? So we decide to scale up production when we think there's an opportunity to lower that unit price. And so I'm going to share with you two examples of this kind of scaling, what it looks like to scale technologies in manufacturing. So the first one is something simple like cutting leather for shoes. So, we can find people today who use templates and actually cut leather by hand. But if we want to increase efficiency, what we would use is we would jump up to using a die cutting process. And so die cutting requires the investment in a dedicated piece of technology. So each of these dies that's hanging on the wall is basically kind of like a metal stamp, right? So if these pieces of metal are put in the press here, we can cut out a piece of material in a second as compared to like maybe the minute it takes to cut out by hand. And so you'll notice we have to invest in all the different dies for all the different sizes of shoes in which we want to potentially produce. But we've gained efficiency because we can reduce the cutting time down to potentially seconds. We can scale up again, and we can utilize what's called a CNC drag knife. And so it's a computer-controlled knife that, in essence, kind of takes what almost is typically just a handheld tool and puts it into a computerized machine. And so we get a different type of efficiency. We can maybe bring back some customization because we can now make sizes in between dies. But ultimately, we're, again, increasing efficiencies because we could actually use a conveyor belt of fabric. And so we're constantly feeding fabric through as another way of speeding up process. And then now in today's world, we also have CNC die cutting. And so we basically have the ability to attach a die to a machine. And again, it can cut out in seconds. And in this picture, it actually is cutting multiple parts in seconds instead of just one part of the shoe upper. It's potentially cutting 3 or 4 at the same time. And again, we can actually attach a conveyor belt of fabric to this machine. And so it's literally cutting hundreds of units in minutes. And so we can see that we scale up in each step, we're gaining an efficiency, which again should reduce the overall unit cost. Another example of scaling production is trying to create a plastic casing for an Internet of Things or sort of a smart object. And again, we can start with a flexible technology like 3D printing. And then we can scale up and gain some efficiencies by using 3D printed molds for low run injection molding. And the injection molding process allows us to make parts, again, in seconds as compared to maybe minutes or even hours with some 3D printers. And in some cases, depending on the design of the mold, we might even be able to make multiple parts in seconds. And the low run injection molding is actually designed to be efficient to a certain scale, meaning this mold might work well for, say, 1,000 units, but then after that, you have to invest in another mold. We can scale up and we can utilize what's called an online production platform. So so I'll talk more about this later on, but ultimately you can outsource production to a company and they can do small runs. And again, they create an efficiency because they invest in tooling. But again, there's a tipping point where at certain run sizes, they lose efficiency. And then lastly, you can go all the way up to an injection molding factory, which you can see can have multiple machines with multiple dies running simultaneously, which means you can make thousands of parts potentially in a week or even just days. So we get the question a lot from entrepreneurs, like, when do I scale production and how do I know when to, say, jump and scale? And so a lot of this is going to be driven by either consumer demand. So let's say you've had lots of success and now you need to start making larger purchases. And so that's going to require you to think about more efficient ways of manufacturing. if you're, and also that could change, that could force you to develop a different supply chain because again, some supply chain partners work at one scale and not another. You might need to jump in scale in order to create a lower price point. So you might, through market research, realize that your consumer has a kind of ideal price point. And so you might not be able to reach that initial price point at, say, the small batch or handmade scale, in which case you might be forced to jump in scale earlier on in the process in order to drive that price down. And lastly, there are times where you just can't find technologies that work at a small scale. We don't necessarily have efficient ways of making small runs of something. And so again, depending on your specific product or your specific kind of market, you might jump in scale in other ways that other entrepreneurs wouldn't. In order to scale, you need to be prepared prepared as in you need potentially access to more capital, or definitely, and that capital could be, just more sales and more revenue. It could be an investment because you might need to invest in new technologies, for example. You also potentially need a different supply chain, and you might need to also go through the process of part redesign or design for manufacturing. And what that last bullet means is, let's say you started out by making small runs using 3D printers. The file needed to run the 3D printer it should be optimized for 3D printing. If you're going to go from 3D printing to injection molding, in order for that part to be that part to be made using injection molding, you're going to have different details. So there's the kind of translation that's going to have to happen as you transition from one manufacturing process to another. And so it's important to be aware of this step in the process from a cost point of view, because it might mean hiring, say, an engineer or finding a contract manufacturer that could do that part redesign for you. And it also, again, might impact how you think about it. Maybe you change your early design, knowing that if you want to scale up, it has to kind of work a certain way, even if you are going to use 3D printing. Another question that comes up around scaling is, how do I price my product? Do I price it for the scaled production or the small run unit price? And so the shorter answer is it depends on the market. And so if your price point, say, is high at the beginning when you're doing small runs, and it's going to drop over time because you'll gain efficiency at a larger scale, then that typically is seen as positive by your market, right? They're likely to be happy to spend less in the future. Whereas if you set your price low because, say, you're printing it yourself, 3D printing it yourself, or you're doing a cut and sew product and you're doing it in-house, if you price it for what you do it versus what a manufacturer could do it at, if your price jumps up, it might put off your initial market and maybe you don't have a return buyer. So ultimately, knowing kind of what your market will bear is important. And maybe you start with one market in one sense at one scale, knowing that as you scale up, it might lead to a different market and different opportunity. And how does scaling impact the price? Ideally, your unit price goes down, but it does mean that you're going to have more upfront expenses. And those upfront expenses are attached to like your part redesign and potentially purchasing dedicated tooling. And you're going to have to be able to afford larger material purchases, payments to contract manufacturers, larger shipping fees, et cetera. So a general rule of thumb is that scaled production requires more money up front, but because you're lowering the unit price, you're going to gain a bigger profit per unit sold in the future. An important concept to be aware of in this is also the idea of amortization of upfront costs, which basically means you're distributing the upfront costs over the production run and or life of the tooling. And so just a really quick example of this, in the world of injection molding, it's not unheard of for tooling costs to be in the, say, $50,000 range. And so if we divide that $50,000 purchase over, say, 100,000 units, which could be the lifespan of the tool, then we simply add, say, 50 cents to every unit price, every unit to recoup the cost of that. Or option B would be, say, we have an initial sales goal of 20,000 units, and so we can add $2.50 to the unit price. Why would we go with B versus A? Well, with B, the idea is that after you've sold 2,000 units, that $2.50 markup, which was going to pay for the tooling, now becomes a profit. And so again, this is up to every entrepreneur to kind of play with this kind of balance of how do I distribute the cost of that tooling over a production run and recoup my costs. And this could be translated to other things. It doesn't have to be just tooling. Research and development costs are dealt with in this way. Material purchases can be dealt this way. The important takeaway is this kind of idea of distributing larger upfront costs over production runs. The question, again, another question we hear a lot is, does my production process translate from one scale to the other? And the short answer is depends. So those of you who are maybe in the apparel industry, cut and sewing is a process that has yet to be really automated. And so if you're cutting and sewing, say 100 units versus 1,000 units to 10,000 units, the scale, there still aren't a lot of ways to gain efficiency in scale and sewing. You can gain efficiency by using automated cutting tools and potentially different types of like dyeing, et cetera. But ultimately, the scaling of the actual sewing process is something that doesn't really scale yet. If you're using plastics and doing plastic manufacturing, there are definitely levels of scale from 3D printing to small batch injection molding to high levels. Same with metal parts. You can do very small runs of metal parts through different types of forming processes, but then you could do larger scale manufacturing in metal using stamping and forming. In the world of 3D printing, if you want to use 3D printing forever and you never want to sort of switch into, say, injection molding or something like that, a lot of people wonder if you can scale with those technologies. And as of now, you can't really scale in the traditional sense because you don't get efficiency. Because you're using the same tool from beginning to end through all your production needs, you're not really going to gain efficiency. You might be able to print multiple parts in parallel, but ultimately it's still requiring X number of hours on the machine. You might get a discount, like a contract manufacturer might discount if you purchase larger orders, but that's still not quite the same as a traditional sense of scaling. Now, if you think you want to scale, it's always important to research future scaled production costs, even when you're starting out, because again, that's going to help with your pricing and maybe help with avoiding lots of redesign or part redesign. So it's important to research opportunity to also reduce tooling costs. So in some cases, you can work with some contract manufacturers and they might be okay, if you allow them to use a tool that you pay for other customers, then they might actually reduce the part of your tooling. And then vice versa, you might actually find some manufacturers that have tooling in-house that they could apply to your project. It might require you to like change your design to meet existing tools that are already available, but it is something to be aware of, especially like say if you're doing packaging for a product. How important is it to you to have your package like exactly 100% customized versus say using a tool for a box that's slightly bigger, but you can make it work and therefore you save tooling costs. And if you know you're going to scale or have an interest in scaling, definitely talk to manufacturing experts early on in the process. It's also important to think about not just the navigating the technical aspects like supply and demand, price, and manufacturing capabilities, but as entrepreneurs, you also have to think about, you kind of have to scale yourself in a way, right? Like if you've been doing everything yourself in a house or in a makerspace, et cetera, as you scale up, you're going to have to be willing to give over some of that control and depend on other people. And so you have to trust your supply chain. You're going to have to potentially grow your skill set. So maybe, again, if you've been making it yourself the whole time, your skill set might have to change and be more about how do I manage a supply chain. And ultimately, too, it might require you kind of outgrowing your comfort zone and taking on a different part of business development. And so in a kind of more psychological way, scaling means you're outgrowing your dorm room, your kitchen, your basement, your makerspace, wherever you've been working. It's also outgrowing existing connections and collaborators. So again, some companies work really well at certain sizes, but you might have to leave them in order to go bigger. It also means, being prepared to spend more time and resources on different aspects of the business, as well as potentially taking on more responsibility as in debt, employees, customers, et cetera. So there is the technical side of scaling, but there's also the kind of psychological and skill set part of scaling. If you want to scale, find mentors, find people who have successfully gone through the scaling process, evaluate your personal and your team strengths, determine your own boundaries, and find resources specifically for scaling. So there are some organizations that are equipped for helping people get the idea started, get through early testing, but then there's other organizations that really specialize in that process of going from early success to growing that success and scaling in all these different ways we're talking about. All right, so again, I'll pause and see if there's any new questions. Okay, I don't see any. So the last two sections are much shorter. So I'll just go through these together, and then we'll get to the kind of more open question and answer. Okay, so if any of you are interested in any of these steps in the manufacturing process, anything from finding a prototype to building a supply chain, et cetera, I want to kind of walk through just the basics of getting started, and then I'm going to share with you some different resources to tap into immediately. So one of the probably most asked questions is, what do I need to talk to a manufacturer? And this is the perfect scenario. Like if you had all the resources available and you wanted to come up with the best kind of package to communicate with the manufacturer, this is what that could include. It could include researching manufacturing processes, organizing details about material specifications down to knowing exactly, say, if you're using a plastic, the exact plastic you want to use and the specific colors you want to use. You'll have gone through a round of like iterative drawing and exploration, making models, technical drawings. You'll have created a refined prototype. You'll know how many units you need. You'll have a timeline. You'll have organized questions. And we know, to be honest, that the perfect scenario is something that very rarely happens. Mostly because as entrepreneurs, we don't necessarily have the skill set to do all these things. We don't have the resources to pay for all these things. Or we don't even know we should do these things. And so the recommendation is, at the very least, in order to get prepared to talk to a manufacturer, have a kind of rough sketch of what it is. It can be rough. Like, don't think you have to be an artist or have technical drawing skills to make a drawing, but a rough sketch with some dimensions can actually start the conversation in a way that just trying to describe it verbally just can't. It's helpful to also find similar products, because that's, sending a picture to a manufacturer saying what I'm trying to do is similar to this but different. Again, it gives the manufacturer a sense of understanding of what you're actually asking of them. You don't have to become a material expert. You can actually describe materials more from a performance requirement. So again, if we're talking apparel, like, are you talking about a performance being it's lightweight, it wicks sweat, or it's something for cold weather? If you're building something that needs to be made out of metal, you can describe it in performance requirements as, does it need to be magnetic or not magnetic? Does it need to be in an outdoor setting, an indoor setting? Does it need to be in a sterile environment? So that's what I mean in terms of performance requirements. Like, what does it actually have to do, or where does it have to do its job, can help a manufacturer help you find the right material. Having a guesstimate of how many units you need in the near and long term is also a big question that a manufacturer is likely to ask very quickly. and it's okay to say, it's okay to communicate that, you've got this vision of being able to say sell 100,000 units 2 years, 3 years down the road, and you're starting out and you need prototypes and say 1,000 units. It's okay to have that dialogue about hypotheticals. Some manufacturers are going to say, well, I can't help you until you reach the bigger scale. Other companies are going to say, okay, I understand where you are in your business development. Here's how I can help now, or here's the insights I can provide. So, it's not necessary to kind of lie and say, I'm ready to make 10,000 units. That's actually potentially going to complicate things. But having a vision of like, now I want to be at this scale, in a year this scale, and 2 years this scale, again, gives a manufacturer a sense of where they can help you and when. Have a timeline together of your first order, because ultimately that's also going to impact how a manufacturer can respond. If they know you're a year away from actually placing an order, they're more likely, again, to be honest and tell you what they can help with or can't help with upfront. And then also, like, some manufacturing processes can be started very quickly, especially if you're using, say, a CNC piece of equipment. But other manufacturing processes require what's called a lead time. And so if you want your first order coming out of the factory in a year, that's going to have to correspond with, say, the timeline for ordering materials. It's going to have to be coordinated with, say, how long does it take to make a piece of equipment if you're getting a dedicated tooling made. So having your own sense of when you would like to see finished units being made helps, again, the manufacturer know what they're doing. And then lastly, just have organized questions. And even if you're still not exactly sure what questions to ask, that's okay. It's still better to say, go into a conversation with a manufacturer or supply chain partner with some educated questions on what it is you're actually looking for from them and how you would like to work with them. So this package of information, as you can see, isn't all that complicated. If it just kind of takes a little bit of time getting it all together. And be prepared, again, like not all manufacturers respond the same way to the same requests for information or same type of engagement. So the more research, the more you've kind of gone through that process of looking online and saying, oh, they work at the scale I want, they work at the quantities I want, they have the type of technologies I need. Going through that process will kind of make it more likely that you'll get the right person on the phone or the right company on the phone. So again, answering those questions about the elements that relate to your product, and then being organized in terms of what information you can share with the manufacturer. All right, so lastly, I want to share with you some resources that are currently available, and then I'll talk a bit about what next steps I can offer and are also in development. So these are in no particular order. So first, it's a resource to know about are makerspaces. And so makerspaces can be really good for prototyping. They can be good for gaining insights about scaling and finding experts. And so in the region, we have a lot of universities that all have different types of makerspaces. Some are accessible by students only. Other are open to students and people from the community. Even if you can't access it to use the tools yourself, all those, if you think about it, there's people who are skilled to know how to make things, how to work with people who are new to making, and so they could potentially answer some of your questions with getting started. Outside of universities, NextFab is our local big makerspace network. They have several facilities in the city as well as in Delaware. And they range from 3D printers to other types of CNC equipment, to also some more traditional fabrication equipment, say like woodworking and metalworking. If you're working on a product that's maybe material specific, like wood or clay, going to Philadelphia Woodworking or Clay Studio, both of those are staffed with experts in their materials and their processes. Public Workshop is also a community-based makerspace, and they have lots of information and lots of hands-on learning processes. I should say NextFab, Philadelphia Woodworking, and Clay Studio also have lots of hands-on learning opportunities. And then Hive 76 is a makerspace that specifically focuses on electronic things and smart products. And so if you're working on a smart product and you are looking for some quick insights and looking for sort of more kind of community-based information, or like maybe you're not quite ready to talk to a manufacturer, but you want some advice, Hive 76 has a whole community of people who have that kind of electronic expertise and could help you develop your ideas. Another resource that's important to know about is called Ben Franklin Technology Partners. They have an initiative called FabNet, and it is a grant fund that can be used by entrepreneurs who are looking to have prototyping or design facilities or services. So in a nutshell, let's say you need a prototype made and the prototype costs $10,000. You can apply for FabNet to provide up to $5,000 of that prototyping costs. The FabNet is made up of, I think, 13 different organizations. And so basically you can go to this website and you can find a list of these 13 businesses that do prototyping services. And you can, it's kind of a little bit of a matchmaking, right? Like if you find the organization that's part of FabNet, you talk to them, you find out the cost, and then you can then apply for the grant funding from Ben Franklin. There's several different online databases that you could tap into. These are good for finding contract manufacturers, for getting insights about scaling, and for finding experts. And again, this slide, you'll get a copy of the slide deck so you can kind of capture these. These range in different kind of audiences. So for example, Makers Row is a database of manufacturers, and they're kind of marketing themselves more towards the small batch manufacturer or the kind of lifestyle brand companies. ThomasNet is probably the most robust database, specifically focusing on manufacturers in America. They have expanded a little bit to Canada and Mexico as well. Alibaba and Compass are international. And so again, like if you want to build global supply chains, these are good places to get started. All of these offer the ability to filter by state, region, country, or by technology, material, et cetera. And they also typically can represent multiple parts of the supply chain, right? So some companies, again, you might be looking for a material supplier to do one thing, a company to do manufacturing, another company to do warehousing. These different databases can also help find other parts of the supply chain. I should also point out that some of these websites are better designed than others, but they are worth looking into. So even just because it's a little bit more efficient and effective than, say, just Googling manufacturers. Oh, sorry, I should go back. Also, one last point to make is that a lot of these websites also offer other insights beyond just here's a manufacturer. Like they typically have blogs and other libraries of information that you can start to review in order to learn more about manufacturing. Online distributed manufacturing is good for finding prototyping and small runs, as well as gaining insights about manufacturing processes. So these are just 5 examples of online platforms, and how these work. The way that these work are you generate a computer file. So it could be a 3D model, depending on if it's a 3D object. It can be a 2D drawing. And you basically create an account. You upload the file. You can pick your materials. You can pick your quantities. And you get back a quote. And if that quote works for you, you can basically buy it. And within, depending on the time frame, within days, weeks, you can actually get units shipped back to your house. These companies tap into Sourcify, Xometry, and Protolabs. They tap into other manufacturing companies. So for example, if you go to Xometry and you upload your part, that part gets sent to hundreds of manufacturers each of which can kind of bid on it, and then you get a quote that's been a little bit kind of vetted in a way. All of these websites offer lots of design insights and tutorials, because ultimately what they want to do is they want to educate you as a potential customer of these platforms. So even if you just want to read about injection molding or metal forming, or metal bending, you can go onto Xometry's website and find design guides for making parts using these different manufacturing methods. Shapeways is an example of a distributed manufacturing platform that's also creating a marketplace. So you can actually utilize Shapeways to not only manufacture your parts, but you can actually sell your products through Shapeways. And so how that works is you can, say, design a ring, they 3D print in precious metals, and then you can create a storefront. And so any other person can go online, purchase your design, Shapeways prints it on demand and sends it to the customer, and then you get a credit, or you get cash. You get paid because it's your design and it's your marketplace. I expect to see more and more of this in the future, just because it's becoming another way in which manufacturers could be competitive, and it's finding ways to tap into all those aspects of Industry 4.0. Books are also very helpful. They're good for gaining insights about manufacturing processes and scaling. And so what I recommend is I teach product design and industrial design. And so these are books that I recommend to students that are just trying to learn about manufacturing and making. These books are written in a way that's not technical, meaning it's approachable. It's meant to take a manufacturing process and make it easy to understand in order to help people then engage with manufacturers about a process. So there's lots of different design and manufacturing books for designers. And so I highly recommend them for entrepreneurs of all sorts, because it's much more, these books are much more approachable than reading, say, a technical article on injection molding. There's online glossaries, which again can be helpful for just finding more insights and more sector specific information. So these are just 3 examples of them. These could be really helpful if you're trying to manufacture a product for a specific industry. So the world of medical device design has its own jargon and own standards. If you're trying to produce for the Department of Defense, right, there's certain requirements and standards. So these glossaries help you get an insight into like what different things mean and what different requirements are in place. Dragon Innovation is an example of a piece of software for managing kind of research and supply chains. They also have a database, vetted database of manufacturers. They also offer different types of assessment services to help you understand if your design is ready for manufacturing. And they offer kind of a series of videos called Design for Manufacturing, which again, as an entrepreneur, it might be helpful to understand how to design or redesign your product to scale up in manufacturing. And then lastly, word of mouth is also a very important resource. So it's good for looking for vetted recommendations. So talk to other entrepreneurs, reach out to other business owners. A lot of times entrepreneurs are really okay and open to sharing who they work with and who their supply chain is, or who not to go to, right? Like it's a good way to maybe, again, quickly gain insights about who to work with or who not to work with. So talk to other people, find other brands that are making similar products, and talk to them and see what they might share. And so lastly, DVRC and myself were working together to also help entrepreneurs. And so one of the things that we're offering is a way in which you can get connected to some of the thousands of manufacturers in the region. So DVRC is part of a statewide network of industrial resource centers. And so part of their work is helping manufacturers do more manufacturing. And so as I talked about at the beginning of the project, my role in this is helping entrepreneurs like yourselves connect to these manufacturers. And so regardless of where you are in your process of developing a product, you can email me and I can help in some way, shape, or form. The process that we go through is we set up an interview process. We talk about where you are in your business development, what type of manufacturing requests you have, et cetera. And then I work with the team at DVRC to generate a set of recommendations. We give those to you freely, and then ultimately part of what I do is I work with you to kind of track the outcomes of those. Did those recommendations work? And if not, how do we help find new ones? We're going to continue this work in the future with the Business Center and the EMSDC's Innovation and Manufacturing Center. So this initiative is ongoing. So this isn't something that you have to take advantage of tomorrow. So if this is wherever you are in your process, again, feel free to reach out. So again, here's my email address. And again, I just want to thank the Business Center and Eastern Minority Supplier Development Council for hosting this discussion. And again, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. So if anybody has any questions, I'm available for a little while longer. And so
Andrew, there were two questions that you were going to come back to. Do you remember what they were? One was from Shakina and one was from Jamie Bracy, if you could address those.
Sure. So one question was, for feminine hygiene product, what manufacturer should I use? That's a really good question, and one I would like to help research. Off the top of my head, I don't have a company in mind, and I think it would also depend on what the product was used for, like what type of materials it is, if it's a one-time disposable, or if it's something that's supposed to be reused. So I'd be happy if you send me an email. I'll put it here in the chat box as well. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you and find out more about your business and who might be able to work with you. The other question was, are there contract manufacturers in the region who work with food-based MVPs? Again, that's off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but I'm happy, again, to help with the research. There are a growing number of businesses in the Philadelphia region that are doing packaged food, and there's if you're trying to find an outsourced manufacturer, then again I could help you do the research and help uncover who might be in the region. There are different companies too that it's interesting kind of concept, but there are people doing technology development for food manufacturing. And so if you're looking for, if you don't find a contract manufacturer, there are pathways to actually investing in and developing technology for food manufacturing. And there are a couple companies in the region that are starting to kind of specialize in that idea. So unfortunately for both of you, I don't have any answers off the top of my head, but if you send me an email, we can schedule a time to talk and I can help do some research and see who we could find.
Andrew, I think there was also a question, but I think you addressed it in terms of what was your opinion about NextFab? Someone is thinking about using that.
So NextFab is great. Like, they offer a lot of different things for people who have no knowledge of any type of making and manufacturing. They host events where different entrepreneurs get to talk about where they are in their process and share their business. They have classes in all sorts of different materials and technologies. They have an incubator program now for people who are developing hardware products called Rapid. The accelerator is called Rapid. They also, if you're interested in potentially, let's say you are a maker or manufacturer yourself, or you do something on your own and you're interested in translating that into more of a production strategy, they also offer a accelerator program for businesses that do manufacturing themselves. Also, NextFab has a very large network of members. And so if you're looking for a company if you're looking for an individual or a resource to do prototyping, they have what's called a job board. And so you can like put a note about what it is you want to have made. And people from the networking community can respond to say, oh, I can make that, let's talk. They do specialize mostly in metals and plastic and wood. So they do have a little bit of textile technology. They don't have anything in, say, like pharmaceuticals or food. So it kind of might depend on what technologies you're looking for. So yeah, so if any other questions come up, feel free to add it in the chat. I just wanted to speak a little bit more about what's kind of in the works. So I'm continuing to work with Pam and Val and TBC, DMSDC, to continue these types of conversations. So we're working on other types of discussions. We're trying to connect other parts of the ecosystem. So and we're also thinking about how do we offer different types of kind of incubation style support. So you can potentially get support in multiple states, from writing a business plan to, to even getting access to prototyping and small batch manufacturing resources. If this was helpful, great. And we'd like to know more about how this was helpful, but we'll also like to continue to keep people in contact for other things that are in the works.
Well, Andrew, certainly looks like it was helpful. A lot of people are saying it was very informative and outstanding presentation. So that's good to
Thank you.
hear.
Yeah.
More to come. We want to make sure that it's a very diverse industry going forward in the manufacturing area. So I certainly learned a lot today myself. And I think you did a good job of covering the basics of manufacturing and then getting more involved intricately with the resources that are available in our region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And as was mentioned at the beginning, this was recorded, so the recording will be shared and the slides will be shared. So so please, I really enjoyed working with entrepreneurs and helping make connections. So please reach out if you think any of this will be helpful, and if you definitely need help. Those resources are really helpful, and a lot of it too comes down to like sometimes just knowing, again, like the keywords to look for, the keywords to put into the different databases. And so again, that's where I can kind of help just through a conversation, figure out what a potential design and manufacturing approach may be.
There's also going to be a evaluation form sent out after the presentation. So we really value your feedback, and it'll help us understand what kind of workshops we should offer in the future.
All right, so that's all I've got. If there's no more questions that come up, then I think we can wrap up.
So we want to thank everyone for participating. And we have your contact information, and we will certainly keep you abreast of other workshops. We hope you thoroughly enjoyed this information. And based on the comments, I think it was definitely informative and provided information and access to resources that people can use within a 24-hour period. So that's great. And we
Awesome.
really hope you enjoy the rest of your week.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.